In this introduction to 3D modeling for 100% absolute beginners, we are going to build out this fantasy sword model. We will start with the practice run, getting you up to speed with the most common 3D modeling tools. Then we will learn the essentials of 3D primitive modeling techniques and build out the sword step by step. Then in part 3, we'll learn about geometry nodes and build the fire effects on the blade and build out the environment. And we'll end with a bonus character integration. If this tutorial looks intimidating for you, I encourage you to keep going. Like many have said in the past, the steps are broken down and are simple and practical for an absolute beginner to follow. All you need is to complete part 1 of the series, and the link is in the description. So stick it out with me to learn the most common 3D modeling tools coming up. In part 1 of the series, we primarily worked by manually clicking on the viewport tools. Although this is a fine way to work when we first start, over time clicking on each one of these can really slow us down as we need to rotate between them a lot. And our goal for this chapter is to begin to integrate some more hotkeys into the workflow. Step number 1 is to download the hotkey cheat sheet. Click the link in the description labeled downloads, and then you will see the download content that we'll be using. For starters, download the hotkey cheat sheet and keep that handy while you work. At the top of our hotkey cheat sheet, we'll have our viewport navigation controls. This is what we learned in part 1 during our Minecraft project. Now we're going to focus on integrating the viewport tools, specifically the G, R, and S hotkeys. And step number 2, we'll start with the G, which is our move and grab tool. Once we hit G on the keyboard, you will notice that the cube starts to move around. All we have to do is simply move around the mouse and then click anywhere to drop it back into our scene. Now if I hit G again, you'll notice that it just starts floating around a bit, and we want to snap it to a specific axis. And we can do so with the X, Y, and Z snapping hotkeys. After you hit G to enter move, we can then hit X, Y, or Z to snap the movement to a specific direction. X is going to be the red axis, Y is going to be the green axis, and then Z is going to be the blue axis. Step number 3 is R for rotation. Once we hit R, you'll see that we start to move around our mouse and we can control the rotation. Then all we have to do is click the mouse again to drop it back into our scene. And step number 4, we have S for scale. Hit S and then we can drag our mouse around, move in and out to scale up and down our cube, and then click to drop it back into our scene. Then if we want to snap our scale or rotation tools, we can then use the same X, Y, and Z snapping hotkeys while we're in the middle of our scale or rotate tool. This snapping method can be a little bit tedious, and this is where I see a lot of people that are new to Blender get really stuck, and this was really tricky for me as well. Now, if you have used Blender a lot in the past, this is totally a fine way to work, and we're going to take a look at an alternative and much simpler way in the next chapter. And the final hotkey is our selection tool, which is W. Now there's a big Blender gotcha here with this selection tool. As you hit W a few times, you will notice that your selection tool begins to toggle through different selection types. This is a very problematic area of Blender. To change this, click and hold the select icon to go down to box select. Throughout the entire course, we're going to use box drag selection. So go ahead and set that now if you haven't done so already. And just remember that if you hit W too many times, this is going to automatically change and not be box drag selection anymore. And in the next chapter, I'll share with you a way of locking the selection with the add-on that we're going to talk about. That's going to make all of this a lot simpler. So how do we simplify the G, R, and S hotkeys? The way I like to work, and the way most people end up following along with me, is by using the Lazy Viewport add-on. This is an add-on that we made that is free to use. I'll show you how to install this after this example. You'll see what this does is after I enable the Lazy Viewport add-on, my G, R, and S hotkeys now are working with the viewport tools, the same viewport tools that we used during the Minecraft project. For me and the thousands of people I've heard from about this add-on, this makes it drastically easier to use the G, R, S hotkeys as they are much more visual, they're way less technical, and then we don't really have to predict which axis we want to be on with the X, Y, Z hotkeys. So how do you start working with the Lazy Viewport add-on? In step number 6, click the downloads again in the description, and then right next to where we downloaded the Blender hotkey cheat sheet, we have our Lazy Viewport button. Click that and it's going to route you over to GitHub, which is where the add-on is located. And then from there, we have a green button at the top right. Click that and then click select download zip. Once you have that downloaded, right click and extract the file. Then go back into Blender, go to the edit menu and go all the way down to preferences. In our preferences, we want to select add-ons in the left side of the panel. And then we're going to click install. Then we just navigate to our lazy viewport file that we just extracted. We do not want the zip file, we want the .py file. So navigate into that directory file and you'll see the Python file, which is in our add-on, and then select it and then click install. From here, we need to enable it. Simply search the lazy viewport using the search menu, then click enable. If you're not seeing anything after you use the search results, you may have attempted to install the zip file, so be sure to install the extracted .py file. Now, if you're already used to the built-in XYZ hotkeys, you're not obligated to use the lazy viewport at all. Both methods work just fine. There's no right or wrong way to move things around in Blender. However, if you are new to Blender, and specifically if you are coming from the Minecraft project, I highly advise you to download the lazy viewport and take on full advantage of it. The default XYZ snapping hotkeys tend to be very problematic for beginners. And the lazy viewport, on the other hand, makes it a much smoother process. Now, the final step is our practice round. Just like if I were to teach you how to do a push-up, it doesn't magically make you strong. You have to practice at it to get strong. Right click on your cube, duplicate objects, hit escape to drop it just like we did in Minecraft. Hit G to move it over, then hit R to rotate it, and then hit S to scale it. And then a very special note here, for the scale tool, we're only going to use the white handle. The white handle is what we're primarily going to be using throughout the course. I'll repeat that again. Right click, duplicate object, hit escape to drop it, G to move it over, R to rotate it around, and then S to scale it on the white handle. Now you want to do this drill 5 to 10 times. Yes, that sounds tedious, but it is much less painful than struggling the rest of the way throughout the course. The key to learning 3D software early on is repetition. Knowing this information doesn't help you if you cannot effectively apply it efficiently. And being able to move with these hotkeys effectively and efficiently along with other tools is crucial for your success moving forward. So get your 5 to 10 practice tries in, and we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal for this chapter is to get to know edit mode by clicking on the object mode drop-down menu. So what is the difference between object mode and then edit mode? Object mode is going to be for doing basic things like layout and animation and lighting. Edit mode is where we enter the world of 3D polygon modeling. For example, in this project for the sword, we'll turn a cube into a blade, and then we're going to turn a cylinder into the guard, and then we're going to use another cylinder to create the handle, and then another cylinder to then create the pommel. For step number 1, we want to practice jumping in and out of edit mode and object mode using the tab hotkey. I'll start in object mode, then first we need to define our selection. I'll select one of my cubes, then I'm going to hit the tab hotkey on my keyboard, which will automatically switch us from object mode into edit mode and then back again into object mode. I'll hit tab to jump back out into object mode, then I'll select another object, I'll hit tab again to then go into edit mode. And then you want to repeat this process over and over at least 5 times. Tab into edit mode, tab out to object mode, and then select another one, tab into edit mode, then tab back out to object mode. Now, a really big Blender trap to fall into is attempting to select other objects while you're in edit mode. Be sure to bring your eyes back to the video for this one. Once you're in edit mode, you're in edit mode for one object. You can only select sections of that object now, and you cannot select any other objects until you jump back out to object mode. Very tricky. And continue practicing. Now, as you jump in and out of object mode and edit mode, you'll notice that there starts to be a lot of stuff that changes inside of Blender. So let's break it down exactly what's changing here and why. For starters, on the left, we have our modeling toolbar, and we're going to be learning a lot about these as we go. Then at the top here, we'll also have our modeling menu, which we'll be diving into more in a bit as well. For now, all we need to know is that our viewport tools and menus are now changing whenever we toggle back and forth between object mode and edit mode. So we can only do things in one mode or the other. In edit mode, the 3 most important items to get to know first is our edit mode selections. At the top left, right next to where it says edit mode, we have 3 different selection modes for vertices, edges, and faces. So what are our vertex, edges, and faces? With any 3D object that we're going to be working with, generally speaking, it's going to be made up of polygons. And a polygon is made up of 4 different verts, 4 different edges, and then 1 polygon face. This is our vertex, edge, and face selection mode. And for step number 2, we're going to use the edit mode selection tools to begin modifying our mesh. After I'm in edit mode on one of my cubes, I'll jump into vert selection mode by hitting number 1 on my keyboard. We can also select these with our mouse, but get some practice in using the hotkeys. And now you'll notice that once we select our move tool, we can select each individual vertex and move it individually. So play around with vertex a bit. And then for step number 3, we're gonna have our edges. So I'll hit the number 2 key on my keyboard to jump into edge mode. We'll select any edges, and then we can start to move those as well. Very, very, very easy. And then for step number 4, we'll jump into face selection mode by hitting number 3 on the keyboard. And then from here, we can select each individual polygon face and then move those as well. Very, very easy. So go ahead and play around with this selection for a bit, and we're going to get to know some modeling operations in the next chapter. Our goal for these next few chapters is to get to know the most common edit mode tools. And we're going to start building the sword after these couple chapters, so this is your chance to get dirty and make mistakes. We're just going to practice a couple tools. And with these edit mode tools, the number one problem I see from beginners, and this was a huge problem I had as well, was not understanding the difference between destructive and non-destructive workflows in 3D. Doing basic move, rotate, and scale operations, this is a non-destructive workflow, meaning no matter how much we distort the original mesh, we can always get back to the original mesh by resetting it to its default values. This is a non-destructive workflow. We can always go back in time. And with destructive workflows, they are the complete opposite. Very similar to cutting a piece of paper with some scissors. Once we cut it, that's it. It's done. We can't magically uncut the piece of paper. This is a destructive workflow. And most of the tools that we use in edit mode are going to be a destructive workflow, which as a beginner can be very problematic, as every action that we do is completely dependent on the action that we do before it, making it a very linear process. So a simple workflow that we can do to help with this is number 1, navigate into position. Number 2, select the mesh. Number 3, select the edit mode tool. Number 4, perform the action. Number 5, undo if necessary. And number 6, repeat all of these steps. And the key process here is that number 5, undo if we need to. Because once we repeat these steps over and over and over, we can very quickly get to a point of no return. And then the undo button, of course, will not save us then. So how do we apply this? Before we get going, let's both reset our scenes so we're both working on the same page. Go to the File menu, go to the New, and then select the General preset to jump into a new scene. Go ahead and hit Don't Save, and now we'll get going. So first, let's try the Extrude tool. So step number 1, I'm going to navigate into position. I'm going to select my default cube, then I'm going to go up to the View menu, hit Frame Selected, or you can hit the number pad period key to jump into place. And we want to be using Frame Selected a lot as we work. Then I'll orbit around so we can clearly see the top of our mesh. Now, the reason why this step is so important is that because if you're looking at this object from a distance, it's very similar to cutting a piece of paper with a tiny pair of scissors, which is very difficult and very unnecessary. And so step number 2, we're going to select the mesh. I'll jump into edit mode by hitting tab. I'm going to jump into face selection mode by hitting 3. Then I'm going to select the top polygon of our default cube. Great, and now that was step number 2, selecting our mesh. And now for step number 3, we need to select our edit mode tool, in this case, our extrude tool, which is the very first modeling operation on the left modeling edit mode toolbar. And then as soon as we select that, we see that we get a new handle. This new handle is how we move on to step number 4, which is perform the action. Whenever we enable this tool, nothing has happened yet. And so to be able to extrude this, we're just going to click and drag upwards on this handle. And now we can see editing this mesh is like working with a normal sized pair of scissors, because these modeling operations happen in our screen space. The bigger our editing area is, the more control we have. And we're going to practice doing this a couple different times. Extrude once, extrude twice. Now, as you work, what you want to do is continue to navigate into place. And we're primarily going to use Shift and middle mouse button to do these micro navigation movements. Number 2, our selection is already made. Number 3, our edit mode tool is already selected as well, so that we can jump straight to perform the action. So I'll click and drag and then navigate into place, click and drag, navigate into place. Continue to do this a few more times to get that practice in. Then we'll do another selection by selecting the side face to extrude that out sideways. I'll select the polygon face, get into position, and then continue to extrude that out. Now, as I work, you'll notice that I'm constantly navigating into position before and after every single action. Every single action that I do, I get closer and closer to my working area so that I'm not working with those tiny scissors and I got more control. Great, and we'll continue with our practice round in the next chapter. Great, now we'll do this again, and this time we're going to use our Inset tool. For step number 1, we'll just navigate into place. We'll get comfortable in our viewport. Now's a good time to go ahead and go up to your view menu and then select frame selected again, or hit the period key on your numpad. Orbit around to get into perspective. And then step number 2, we need to set the selection, which is already done for us at this point. And then step number 3, we need to select the edit mode tool. So I'm going to select my Inset tool, which is directly under my Extrude tool. Then as soon as we do, we see that we get a new circular shaped handle. Now, before I perform this action, I want you to pay very close attention and bring your eyes back to the video. Now on this handle, I'm going to click and drag. Now, while I'm still dragging this, while I'm still in drag mode, I have all the control I want to be able to move this wherever I want. But then as soon as I let it go, the operation is then performed. Just like cutting a piece of paper, we want to be very patient and slow with these operations so that we get them just right. And then I'll let go of my mouse to complete that action. And then now we're going to go ahead and practice step number 5, which is undoing this. So I'm going to go up to my edit menu, hit the undo button, and there we go. Now we can redo this. But if we were to continue on with this, we may not be able to get back that far. Now we can perform that action again. I'll click and drag on my handle, being very patient as I get it into place, releasing to confirm that action. Great, and now I'm going to switch back to my Extrude tool and extrude this inwards. I'll select the Extrude tool, which is directly above the Inset tool once again, and then I'm going to click and drag on that handle to extrude that in. And as you can see here, with just these 2 tools alone, we can start to create some very complex shapes. And then the next tool we're going to get to know is the Merge tool. So first I'll select my Select tool, and that will deactivate the Extrude tool that we were currently on. So step number 1, I'm going to get into position. I'm going to rotate around and get on the side of our extrusions. Then step number 2, we need to do our selection. I'm going to jump into vert selection mode by hitting number 1 on my keyboard. And then I'm going to select one of the vertices. And then I'm going to use shift on my keyboard to select the second vertice directly next to it. Now in this case, step number 3, which is select the edit mode tool, and step number 4, which is perform the action, are the same button. So I'm going to go up to my mesh menu. I'm going to go down to merge, and then I'm going to choose merge at center. And then after we hit that button, we should then see that our vertices are now one vertice. This is our merge tool. We don't have much control over it. It just kind of does what it does. Now I'll try the merge tool one more time, but instead of using the menu, we're going to use a hotkey. I'll select the bottom vert here, and then I'm going to use shift on my keyboard to select the second vertice directly next to it. And then we're going to use the hotkey M to jump into our merge menu. And then there we see our menu, merge at center, just like we did before. And the next tool is our loop cut tool. What this does is it adds a new edge that wraps around the existing edges on your surface. Use Ctrl-R to activate your loop cut. Hover your mouse over to find an edge center. This step is a bit tricky. As you hover your mouse around, you'll notice that this can be a bit hard to find. The preview edge starts to jump around a bit. So bring your mouse back to the very center of an edge to stabilize it. Once you find it, click to enter the loop cut slide. Then immediately hit escape to drop it, which will create a new loop cut directly in the middle of the 2 edges. There are other ways to use this loop cut tool as well, but for this complete beginner's course, we're going to keep it very simple, and that's the only way we're going to use it throughout the entire course. And we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal right now is to transform a cube into the very tip of the blade using edit mode. And the very first step to do that is to block in a low-res version of the mesh. Then we're going to add details in as we go. For step number 1, we're going to reset the scene. Be sure to do this now. This new file is going to be the one that we're going to carry through the remainder of the course, and we want to start fresh here so that we're both going to be on the same page. And then step number 2, I'm going to set the initial scale values for the tip of the blade. I'm going to start with the default cube. I'll select that. I'll jump into my object properties, then our scale values to a value of 0.23, 1, and then 0.06. And that is going to be our scale X, Y, and Z. Then after you apply those values, what we should start to see now is we have a rectangular shape. And how did I get these values? These are all from when I prepped the lecture. Normally I would eye this up in the viewport, but let's both start here so we're setting ourselves up for our success. Then step number 3, we need to add more resolution to the mesh. I'll hit tab to jump into edit mode. Then you'll notice that everything is selected by default the first time we jump into edit mode. That's what we want. If yours isn't selected, go up to the select menu and the very top, select all. Then continuing in edit mode, I'm going to right click on our top option and hit the subdivide button. Click that, and what you should then see is that we now have more edges to work with, which makes this as a destructive workflow so that we can modify it in edit mode. Then step number 4, we're going to use our merge tool, and we're going to do so with the help of the same modeling workflow we did in our practice rounds. So step number one, we're going to navigate into place. I'll go up to the view menu. I'll hit frame selected while I have everything selected on my mesh. So super important that we do this now. These next few chapters, we're going to be working very closely to the mesh and we want greater control. And again, we don't want to be working with that tiny pair of scissors. Then afterwards, super close, step number three, we need to select our mesh. For our working area, I'm going to hit 1 on my keyboard to jump into vert selection mode. And then I'm going to box drag select the very tip of the cube. And note here I have 9 verts selected. I'm going to rotate around to confirm that I got them all. And a very special note here, the vertices that we've selected should be on the negative y-axis, which basically means the green handle that does not have the Y letter on the 3D axis should be pointing towards us, not away from us. And the reason why is that's just going to help us stay on the same page throughout the course. And then step number 3 and step number 4, select a tool and perform the action. With our merge tool, is it going to be the same action again? I'll hit M hotkey to get our merge menu, and then I'm going to choose merge at center. And then what you do, you should start to see that we now have a tip starting to happen. We're starting to get it somewhere. Now we're going to repeat this for the side. I'm going to select 3 different verts this time on the side, making sure I've deselected the original selection, hit M and then merge at center. Then I'll select the 3 more in the back, hit M, merge at center. Great, and now we have one side done and starting to feel like a blade. I'm going to rotate around to the other side, select 3 verts, M for merge at center, then repeat once more for the back. And a super very special note here, we're not going to merge these verts all the way in the back here, in the back center. We're going to use that for the thickness. Great, and that was our merge tool, blocking in the low poly version of the blade. And this is how we usually start modeling, starting low resolution and then slowly layering details onto the mesh as we work towards the final result. And we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal now is to set up Blender's backup system. As you move forward, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes and you're going to need to redo sections. This is how we all start as beginners. So step number 1, let's set up our Blender project directory. On your computer, make a directory called CG Fast Track and we'll throw everything inside of there. Then inside of there, save your sword into a sword.blend file inside of Blender, inside of that directory. Then you'll want to create a downloads folder as well and throw all the downloadable content from this course inside of that directory. This will help you stay a bit more organized. Blender often works with relative paths, meaning later on when we make connection to textures, this becomes much more forgiving and then we can move our CG Fast Track directory around our hard drive with more flexibility. So how do we get backups going? Step number 2, you want to make sure that your auto save is on. I'll go up to my edit menu, I'll go down to preferences, then down to save and load. And we want to make sure that auto save checkbox is turned on. And what this will do for us is every 2 minutes, it'll automatically save our file. This is most useful if Blender accidentally crashes on us. Then we recover our autosaves under the file menu, then recover, then we have recover autosave. Very useful. Last session is also useful. This opens the last state of your Blender file whenever you quit out Blender last time. And then step number 3, we need our save versions. All we need to do is set the save versions here to a value of 20. And what this is going to do is automatically make incremental backups of our Blender file. Each and every time we hit our manual save file. Helps us when we make a mistake and say our bevel tool, for example, goes into chaos mode and you can always get to a backup where that issue wasn't present. And this really works well because with the CG Fast Track format where we break everything down into bite-sized chapters, so worst case scenario, you only have a few minutes to redo rather than a 3-hour course. Now, opening these backup files are a bit tricky. So step number 4, let's practice opening these up. Go ahead and save your file with save as if you need to, and then hit save a few times. And each time we do that, we'll get a new backup snapshot going. And we can open these up if we go into our file open menu. But the problem is here, whenever we look at this, we don't actually see them by default. So what's going on here? We need to adjust our file filters, and then we need to turn on .blend files. Now we should start to see that each and every time we save, we can now open these back up in our file open button very easily. All right, and once you have your backup system going, we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal right now is to take the block in of our blade and add in a center groove using our bevel tool. And for step number 1, what I'm going to do is just rotate the viewport around so I can easily see the base of my blade. That's just going to allow us to make the selection a little bit easier. And then step number 2, we just need to make the selection. So I'm going to hit 2 to go into edge mode on my keyboard. And then I'm going to select the center edge right here. Now what we want to do is select all the way around the back. So I'm going to shift select this back 2 edges right here. And then I'm going to shift select that bottom one right there. So now we have a total of 4 edges selected. And just a note here, I do not have the tip selected. So we do not want to have the tip selected right here. Once we have those 4 edges selected, I'm going to jump into my bevel tool. But before we try this on the blade, bring your eyes back to the video. There's a couple blender traps to check out first, so let's go over the do's and don'ts of the bevel tool. Number 1, being overly aggressive. A little bit goes a very long way. Number 2, being zoomed out. This also makes the tool work more aggressively. Number 3, dragging on the handle in the wrong direction. Makes it unstable. And then number 4, accidentally clicking on the bevel tool twice. You only want to touch this once. And what we do want to do is, number 1, be very gentle. Number 2, drag in the direction of the handle. Regardless if the direction of the handle looks like it's going the wrong way, drag in the direction it's going anyway. Okay, now it's your turn. And after we have our edges selected and we've selected the bevel tool, and we want to be very gentle with this. And I'm just going to click and drag on that. And I'm roughly going to go about 30% of the way. Yours does not have to be perfect. It doesn't have to match mine exactly, but somewhere in that ballpark should be good. And then step number 4, we need to add a loop cut directly down the center of the mesh. I'll hit Ctrl+R to enter the loop cut mode. I'm going to hover my mouse over to find the center of the edge. And then once I find it, I'm going to click once. But now instead of dragging and dropping it, what I'm going to do is hit the escape key on my keyboard. And what this is going to do is drop it perfectly into place at the center of the mesh. So escape mid loop cut drops it at the center. Very good. And then for step number 5, I'll scale this inward. I'll hit S to jump into my scale tool. And then super special note here, we're only going to be scaling on the blue handle downward. And then after we have that scaled inwards, we'll see that we now have our groove blocked in. At this point, it's a good idea just to rotate around, look at the top, look at the bottom, make sure that everything's looking good. And then after that, we'll go ahead and start adding some more details in the next chapter. At this point in our model, something feels off, something is missing. So our goal right now is to add in a slight roundness to the edge to add a bit of realism into our blade. We're going to do this with the help of our Subdivision Surface Modifier, our Sub-D modeling workflow. And step number 1 is to add in our Subdivision Surface Modifier. We'll go to our modifier panel, the wrench icon, we'll go up to Add Modifier, and then in the second column, all the way to the bottom, the 5th one from the bottom, we're going to choose Subdivision Surface. And then once you click that, what you'll see that is now we get our cage mesh. We have our cage mesh, and we have our final subdivided mesh. So now we are officially in Sub-D modeling mode. And then step number 2, we'll set our Sub-D settings. The first one is levels and viewport. And we're going to want to change that to V2. And what that's going to do is just guarantee us that our viewport, which is what we're looking at right now, is going to be the same as our render. And we'll talk more about rendering in a bit. And that's basically just so we don't get any unpredictable results later on. And the second setting we want to get to know is our modifier display settings over here. And by default, we can see the modifier in edit mode, object mode, and rendered mode. We are going to turn off visibility in edit mode, the second icon to the left. Disable that and it'll turn gray. And then we can no longer see it in our viewport while we're in edit mode. And if we want to see the final mesh, we can tab out back into object mode. So we can tab back and forth to see our cage mesh and to see our final subdivided mesh. Why are we doing this? This is going to allow us to be able to see it a little bit easier. After you get used to Sub-D modeling, you can go ahead and turn that back on and play around with that. Now we have one more problem that we're seeing here, and that is the surface of it feels rough. It doesn't really feel smooth yet. So in step number 3, we're going to fix that with our shade smooth setting. So to do that, we need to be in object mode. This does not work in edit mode. So once you're in object mode, we'll right click on the object and then we'll go to shade smooth, which is all the way at the top. Shade smooth, and then we'll see all of a sudden we got a very smooth surface going. Now, obviously this isn't looking good at this point. This isn't what we want. It's a little too round at this point. So we'll go ahead and start fixing that in the next chapter. Our goal now is to fix the cage mesh so that our subdivision modifier can function correctly. For step number 1, we need to delete the entire back faces. While I'm in object mode, I'm going to select my blade. I'm going to hit tab to jump into edit mode. I'm going to hit 3 to jump into face selection mode, and now we need to select the back faces. I'll jump into my select tool, I'll select one of the back faces, and then I will shift click the remaining of the back faces. Great, and then once we have all them selected, we can then perform our delete. So I'll hit X on my keyboard to jump into the delete menu, then we'll choose delete faces. Then once we have that, you'll notice that if you jump back out into object mode, you'll notice that the back edge is now fixed. We have our cage mesh fixed for that area, but the rest of it is still too smooth. So how do we fix that? For step number 2, we need to add some resolution to our mesh. I'll jump back into edit mode by hitting tab. And currently we are too low poly. This isn't enough polygons for our subdivision modifier to work correctly. I'll go to my select menu. I'll do select all, the very top option. And then after we have the entire mesh selected, I'm going to right click and then choose subdivide, the very top option, just like we did it when we blocked in the blade. Once you have that, if you start to tab in and out of object mode and edit mode, you'll start to see the mesh is now holding its shape a lot more. This is what we're after, but it's still not enough. It still feels too round. So how do we solve this? There are a few different ways we're going to get into in this course to be able to do this, such as edge creases, and there's also holding edges, which is adding more loop cuts, but we're going to keep things super basic for this example. For step number 3, we have a basic solution for this problem, which is our simple smoothing in our subdivision modifier. I'll go back to my subdivision modifier, then I'll change the option from Caramel Clark over to simple. So what is all this doing? Very similar to when we right click and subdivided our mesh in edit mode, this simply adds more resolution to our mesh without adding a smoothing operation. Now the question you might be asking is, why wouldn't we just do another subdivision in our edit mode? This is because our subdivision modifier is non-destructive, which means we can always just adjust this later on as we continue and extend our mesh out to be its full length. And so step number 4, we need to add a new subdivision modifier to get our smoothing back. I'm going to go to my add modifier, go to the second column, and then the 5th one to the bottom, we're going to choose subdivision surface modifier again. I'm going to add that. And then for my values, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to disable visibility in edit mode. Then I'm going to turn the levels in both the viewport and rendered mode to 1 and 1. And then I'm going to leave the Caramel Clark setting on, which of course is just a fancy word for smoothing the object. Now, if I tab back out into object mode, we should now see that our blade is starting to feel a lot more hard surface. This is starting to feel like what we want. Okay, so that's a wrap for this chapter, but a few bonus tips here. We can control how sharp this is by controlling the first subdivision modifier. I'm going to leave off with a value of 2, but if I lower this to a value of 1, you'll notice that the tip becomes rounder. And if I raise this up to 3, it gets sharper. It's because we have more resolution for our subdivision modifier to work. Now, for rendering purposes, I'm going to leave off with a value of 2. This is so that later on in the course, the light will catch the edge a little bit better. And although that's not as realistic, it's going to feel a lot more realistic in the end. And we'll continue in the next chapter. The goal now is to extend the blade to its full length. For step number 1, we need to make our selection, which is the back edges of our blade. In object mode, I'll select my blade. I'll hit tab to jump into edit mode again. Then I'll hit 2 on my keyboard to jump into edge selection mode. First, I'm going to show you what not to do, so bring your eyes back to the video for this one. In Blender, if you try to perform a selection from the wrong angle, you might accidentally miss a selection. Blender's 3D viewport by default only selects what is visible. It doesn't select through an object. Okay, now it's your turn. So rotate your 3D view around to get into position, and then box drag select the entire back edge of the blade, and then rotate around and just make sure you have everything selected. And then for step number 2, we need to do our extrusion. I'm going to select my extrusion tool. Now we have another Blender gotcha here, so bring your eyes back again to the video. If I quickly make an extrusion, you'll notice that I get this magic little pop-up panel at the bottom left of my 3D view. This is our last action operator panel. This is historically problematic because if you click anywhere or activate any tool immediately after doing this, the menu disappears, it goes away, and it's hard to get back. The last action operator panel is only displayed in your last action. And if you click anything or activate another tool, that is technically another action in Blender. So I'll undo my extrusion, and now it's your turn. I'll click and drag to perform the extrusion. Now before clicking anywhere, you want to go down and find your last action operator panel. Then click to expand it. And if you accidentally don't get this, just go ahead and undo out of that extrusion and do it again. And here we can perform some additional settings to the last action that we just did. In this case, I'll set the move to 4.8 in the Z axis, then the default value of 0 in both X and Y. Now, where did I get the value of 4.8? Those again are all from when I prepped the lecture. This will make a little bit more sense in a couple chapters. Then there we go. We should now see that we have the full length of the blade. And if I tab back out in object mode, the subdivision settings that are all non-destructive are automatically applied to that new part of the mesh. And we're all set, and we'll continue in the next chapter. The goal now is to add a slight taper effect to the blade. So it's going to be wider at the base and then slimmer at the tip. For step number 1, we need to add a simple deformer modifier. While I'm still in object mode, I'm going to go to my modifiers panel, select add modifier, and then in the third column about halfway down, we have the simple deformer modifier. And then after that, you should start to see something starting to happen to the mesh. So what's going on? In step number 2, we need to apply our settings. First, I'm going to collapse the first 2 subdivision modifiers to make a bit more space to work. Then we have our third simple deformer modifier that's going to be expanded. First, I'm going to disable visibility in edit mode on the simple deformer modifier so that we can easily see the cage mesh if we go back to edit mode. Then I'm going to select the taper operation, and then I'm going to select the y-axis. We need the y-axis because if we see the top left of the 3D view, this is the direction that the blade is going. So that's the direction that we want our deformer to go. Now to test this out, if we click and drag on the factor setting, going left and right, we can start to see that the taper effect has started to be expanded and contracted depending on the values that we set here. I'm going to manually set this to a value of 0.35 in the factor. And that's just going to give a very, very, very slight tapering effect. And a special updated note from our frequently asked questions. If your taper effect is getting smaller at the base, this happens because technically your blade is rotated in a different direction as mine. So if you're having this issue, rotate the blade 180 degrees, then hit apply rotation. This should fix the taper direction issue. But special note here, you only want to do this if the taper direction is going the wrong way. Now back to the video. Now technically this is making our blade bigger overall, which is not what we want. We wanted the tip to taper in, not the base to be expanded out. So we can compensate for this with the scaling operation. And so step number 3, we need to adjust the scale of our object. I'm going to go back to my object properties panel, making sure my blade is still selected. Then in scale X, I'm going to scale this down to a value of 0.18. And by scaling this down, overall, the blade is still going to be the same width. It's just getting a little bit smaller towards the tip. And that was tapering the blade, and we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal right now is to block in the rest of the mesh objects using the primitive shapes. And then in the future chapters, we'll begin modeling and shaping them out. For step number 1, I'm going to create our cylinder primitive shape. First, we'll go to our object mode, and then we'll go over to our add menu, and then we'll find the sub menu, which is mesh. A quick tip here, the add menu is technically available in both object and edit mode, but since we're creating an entirely new object, we want to make sure that we're in object mode and not edit mode before creating these new objects. In our mesh submenu, we'll find a lot of different primitive shapes that we can start to work with. These are generally speaking how we're going to start our modeling process with one of these primitive shapes. Then we'll go down to cylinder. This is what we'll be using for the remaining shapes. For step number 2, immediately after clicking the cylinder, before doing anything else, we want to go to our last action operator panel. This is going to be labeled add cylinder. If you do not see this panel, it's most likely because you perform some action, you click something, and it disappeared. This is a very common thing to happen. So if you need to get this back, you can always use the hotkey F9, or you can just delete the cylinder and create it again. Just know that you don't want to click anything if you want to access this menu after you perform an action. We can expand the operator panel by clicking on it, and there we'll see all the default values that create our cylinder. We want to change the vertices to a value of 10. So why are we changing this to a value of 10? This is going to make our cylinder a bit more low polygon. Generally speaking, while we're modeling, we want to start low poly and then add details onto it, which then will become our higher resolution polygon mesh. And then our final step in here, we want to change the cap fill type to none. This will give us an empty space at the top of our cylinder, which we're not going to use later on down the road. So we'll go ahead and get rid of that now. Now we need to move the cylinder into position for the guard. I'll go back over to my object properties, and then under location Y values, we're going to use the value of 5.82, and then we're going to rotate it 90 degrees in the X value. And a special note here, if your blade is not going in the right direction, the solution for that is to rotate the sword 180 degrees in the Z axis. And then I'll set the scale X to 0.275, the scale Y to 0.13, and then scale Z to 0.1. So where am I getting all these values? Again, this is all from when I prepped the lecture. Usually I would just eye this up in the viewport, but to help us stay on the same page, let's manually set these numbers so that all the parameters and everything will sync up down the road. Now, before we move on, this is a very good time for us to frame selected since we have our guard in place. So that'll bring us super close and be ready to work. And then this object will eventually become our guard. And then for step number 3, we're going to duplicate the cylinder a couple different times and then set the value for the handle, the pommel base, and the pommel tip. I'm going to right click duplicate objects, hit escape to drop it, and then while my duplicate is still selected, I can easily set my values then. I'll set my location Y value to 6.54, and then my scale values to 0.12, 0.12, and 0.62. And then we just repeat this process over and over. So bonus tip here, if you want to be able to jump through these settings quickly, while you have your parameter selected, you can easily jump to the next parameter by hitting your tab key on your hotkey. And if I'm moving too fast for you here, I'll have all the scale values on my screen at the end of the chapter for you to easily check them. Next, we're going to need the base of the pommel. So I'll right click and duplicate objects one more time. Then while my duplicate is still selected, I'm going to set my location Y value to 7.3, and then my scale values to 0.095, and then 0.095 once more, and then 0.15 for the last scale. And then that's going to end up being the base of our pommel. And then now we need one more, and that's going to be the fifth pommel tip. So I'll right click, duplicate object, set my location Y to 7.58, and then the scale values to 0.13, 0.13, and 0.13. And then one curveball setting, our rotation X on the last one, we're going to set to a value of 0, because that's going to be pointing straight up. And that was a lot to digest here, so I'm going to then display all my values for every single object on my screen. And you want to have all these to close as perfect as possible, as this is going to be setting us up for the remainder of the course. And then we'll continue in the next chapter. The goal now is to bring in our reference image, and we're going to use the quad view to help model out the guard. Step number 1, be sure to grab the downloads links down below the video, then put those inside of your project directory that we set up earlier. Then step number 2, we're going to bring in the reference image. I'll go up to my file menu, then we'll go down to append. This append button is how we import other Blender files into our current Blender file. After we hit append, we should then see project directory, and then we want to navigate to our downloads directory. And then make sure you have everything extracted. Blender doesn't work with zip files. And then we're going to jump into our sword reference.blend file. Once I dive inside that, we are now actually technically inside of that Blender file, and we can grab specific objects. I'll navigate to collections. We'll talk more about collections in a bit, and then we'll see our sword reference. That's what we want. I'll select that, and then I'm going to hit append. So what's happening here? We don't see anything different just yet, and that's going to bring us to step number 3, which is setting up our quad view. I'll go up to the view menu, and then the last option at the very bottom, area sub menu, which then will choose toggle quad view. Then what we should then see after we hit that button is that Blender now has 4 different views inside of the one 3D view. Now this can all be very intimidating at first, so let's break this down. The bottom 2 views we're going to completely ignore. We're not going to be using them for this example. In our top right, we have our 3D view, the same view that we have been working with. Then our top left view, we have our top orthographic view. So we're looking at the objects from top down in this perspective. And orthographic is just a fancy word that we use for viewing things without 3-dimensional perspective. In that top orthographic view, we can navigate around using our navigation tools. I'll shift middle mouse button click and drag around just like the normal 3D view to pan around. And then we can also zoom in and out using the middle mouse scroll, just like we did in our 3D view. The only difference here now is that we can actually orbit in the top orthographic view because this is only 2-dimensional. We cannot orbit around. Okay, but as we navigate around, we can still see that the reference image, it's still hard to see. This brings us to step number 4, which is setting up our wireframe mode. At the top right of my 3D view, our 3D view menu, same place where our object and edit mode is, we want to go all the way to the right until we find our viewport shading options. And a quick bonus tip here, if you do not see this menu, you may need to middle mouse scroll back and forth while your mouse is hovering over it. And this technique that I'm using is compatible with any area in Blender. So if you need to scroll in the top tabs and then middle mouse scroll in the properties panels or the outliner, you can basically scroll on any Blender menu. So what is our viewport shading menu? By default, we are on the solid view. That's what we currently have, and that's what we currently see. And on the left, we have our wireframe mode. We're going to turn on the wireframe mode. And we'll talk about what the other 2 options are later in the course. Now, after turning on wireframe mode, we now see that we can see through the object. This is our wireframe mode. So you can think of this as tracing through a piece of paper. Very simple. And another bonus tip here, on your future projects, if you want to bring in your own reference, you can do so with the add menu, then the image submenu, and then click on reference. Note that we're not going to do this now because ours is already set up for us. Why did I already set this one up for us? Just to make it a little bit simpler and so that we're guaranteed to both be working with the same values as we move forward with the project. And that was our wireframe shading mode, and we'll go ahead and continue in the next chapter. The goal now is to extrude out the guard using our extrusion tool. And in this chapter, we're going to start with blocking in the extrusions first. Reminder to do a manual save starting with this chapter, just in case we need to open up a backup. This is where we're starting to get into. You might want to redo a couple chapters here and there. Now for step number 1, we're going to navigate into place. First, I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to make sure that I'm in object mode, and I'm going to select my little tiny guard cylinder right above my blade. And then we're going to snap to this. I'm going to go up to my view menu, and then we're going to go down to frame selected, but this time we're going to choose the frame selected with our quad view, which will snap all of our quad views into place. Now is the perfect time to be doing the frame selected because we're going to be working with the guard for the next several chapters. Then before we do anything else, in our top orthographic view, we just want to zoom out a little bit so that we can see just the left side of the guard. We don't need to see the right one. We're going to end up mirroring this to the other side in a couple chapters. Then step number 2, we're going to make our selection. I'll hit tab to go into edit mode while my guard is selected. Then I'm going to hit 3 to jump into my face selection mode. Then I'm going to orbit around and select the side face. A special note here, while we're in wireframe, it's a bit hard to see the faces, but we have these little tiny dots here in the middle of each polygon. We want to select that, and then we'll get the highlighted face for the side. Then step number 3, we're going to do our horizontal extrusions. Now, this is the distance we want to go. One extrusion to match the first vertical edge, then another extrusion to match the second edge. Whenever we're extruding horizontally, we want to match the vertical edges. Whenever we're extruding vertically, we want to match the horizontal edges. I'm going to select my extrusion tool, and then I'm going to extrude out. Now, after I get into position, immediately after, I'm going to hit the G hotkey to jump into my move tool, then tweak from here. A common habit that we all have when we first start is that we want to keep tweaking, but then use the extrusion tool to tweak, which will of course create more extrusions. So we want to get in the habit, extrude out, hit the move tool, and then tweak from there. And I'm only using the horizontal move tool, the red axis here. Then I'll jump back into my extrusion tool to do the second one. I'll extrude out and then immediately jump into G to do the final tweaks and then tweak it on the red axis. And then that was our horizontal extrusion. So now we have step number 4, which is to do our vertical extrusions. I'll start by selecting my extrusion's bottom face with face selection mode on. And now I'm going to be lining up the first one to the left edge and then the second one to the right edge. This one is a little tricky. I'll grab my extrude tool again, extrude down to match the first one on the left, hit G to do any tweaks, only move it on the green axis to do the vertical movement, and then do my extrude tool again, extrude out to match the bottom one, hit G to do any tweaks, and there we go. And once we have the vertical extrusions, now step number 5, we're going to do our final extrusion. There's just one extrusion left. I'm going to select the side face on my new extrusion, extrude that out all the way, hit G to tweak if needed, and there we go. That's going to be our block in for our extrusion. Now, of course, this is looking super blocky, so we'll continue matching the reference in the next chapter. The goal now is to move our verts into position matching the reference. I'll start by hitting 1 on my keyboard to jump into vert selection mode. Now for this chapter, I want you to keep your eyes on the video and watch this technique I'm going to use. The steps and context of the buttons and software is fairly straightforward, but it's the technique that's going to make this simpler. And so first I'll show you what not to do. What not to do, number 1, is select individual vertices just with a single click. If you do that, you'll immediately notice that as you move that you start to get a triangular shape in your wireframe mode. This means that we did not select the backside. So each and every time we select here, we always want to be doing box drag selection. That is how we avoid this issue. The second one not to do is moving things one section at a time. This is going to lead to a lot of dents in your mesh, and this is a hard surface mesh, so we want to be as precise in the way we move things around as possible. I'm going to undo out of all of that. Now here's the technique that we want to be doing. And remember to keep your eyes on the video for this one. I'm going to select each row vertically first. Then I'm going to move the entire row vertically into place. Then after that I get the top vert into place, I'll then deselect and then select the bottom 3. So I'm going to be working with the whole row at first and then working my way down. Then I'll match up the second one, then I'll deselect, then I'll repeat them for the 2, lining up in this case on the bottom one. And then I take that exact concept and bring it to the next row. So I'll select the entire row, match the top edge, and super special note here again, this is our cage mesh. So you'll notice here that my mesh is actually slightly bigger than what our reference is here. So that when we apply our subdivision later, it'll collapse and hold shape a little bit better. I'll deselect those, select 3 more, move that up. And now I'm going to be matching the horizontal edge to the right. I'll deselect that again, select 2 of them, then move it up, matching the edge again. Then select the bottom one, continuing to use box drag selection as I move it up. Then we have the last 2 on the end, so I'll select them, line them up, and then select the bottom, and then just move it up vertically. So I'm going to be focusing on moving things one directional as much as possible. And then just a general note, after you have everything blocked in, these 2 areas are going to be the most problematic. These are going to be your toughest ones to do. That is because these 3 verts on each side need to be perfectly sharp. But I've built these things 10 plus times now, so I'm going to be making it look easy for you. You might get halfway through and want to start this thing completely over, and that's totally fine. And a reminder here, if you ever need to get your backups, go to the File, Open menu, go to your filters, select backup.blend, and then you can get your backup there. And then you can just sort by date, go back a few minutes ago, and then try again, no big deal. And that's that, and then we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal for this chapter is to taper the side of the guard. Right now you can see it feels very blocky and square, and we're going to taper it in and make it a bit sharper. And we're going to do so with the help of proportional editing. A normal edit looks like this. We only move what we currently have selected. But with proportional editing, it acts if the mesh is rubber and sticky, and it'll move everything around your currently selected vertices. For step number 1, we want to get out of quad view. We will not be using this for quite some time, and we want our edit mode tools, as we use them, to have as much screen space as possible. And then we're done with wireframe mode as well, so I'll switch back to my solid view and we're ready to get working. Then for step number 2, we're going to apply a proportional editing. I'll navigate around to find the tip of the mesh. Then I'm going to hit 3 on my keyboard to jump into face selection mode, and then I'll select the very tip of the guard. Once we have that selected, we can then activate proportional editing, which is the circular shaped icon at the top of the center of our viewport. Once we have that activated, you'll notice nothing really changes at first, but from here what we're going to do is hit S on the keyboard to jump into the scale tool and then scale down on the blue axis. And now you will see that a lot more of the guard is now going to start to be affected by this. The closer it is, the more it's getting affected, and the further away the vertices are, the less it gets affected. And that's it. We just bring it down just a little bit and then we're good to go. And that's it for this chapter. And as a bonus, if we want to go into our last operator panel, we can adjust how much is being affected. If we click and drag on the proportional size, we are now affecting more or less mesh based on the distance that we set. So the higher the value, the more it's going to affect further away vertices. The default value is a value of 1, which is perfectly fine for this example. And there we go. And we'll continue in the next chapter. The goal for this chapter is to mirror the left side of the guard over to the right side, and we're going to do this with the help of the mirror modifier. For step number 1, we're going to make sure to turn off proportional editing. Accidentally forgetting to turn this off is a very, very common mistake that we all do, and I saw this a lot in the original release. So be sure to keep an eye on that. We'll turn that off for now. Step number 2 is to delete the second half of the guard. I'll get into position so that we can work a little easier. I hit 3 on the keyboard to jump into face selection mode, and then I'm going to box drag select all 5 of the polygons on the right side of the guard. So we should only have 5 selected total. Then I'll orbit around to make sure that we have them selected. I'll hit X, and then we're going to select delete faces. Once you do that, we should then have only half the guard, and we're ready for the mirror modifier. For step number 3, we'll add the mirror modifier. First, I'll go down to my blue wrench icon, and then we'll go to add modifier. And then in the second column, towards the middle, we'll find our mirror modifier. And then once you see that, we should now see that we have the second half of the guard done automatically. And the great thing about this is the modifier system is non-destructive, right? So any edits that we do to the left side from here on out will automatically be applied to the right side. Pretty awesome. A few bonus tips. Generally speaking, the mirror modifier is fairly straightforward. A few tips, it'll mirror based off wherever the origin is, which is this orange dot in the center of our object. And then the only attributes in this that I usually tweak are going to be the axis attributes. By default, this value should work for us, but sometimes I find myself changing it from X to Y to Z, depending on the original layout of my model. We'll leave everything the default values, and we have 2 chapters left with the guard. The problem we're trying to solve in this chapter is with this big empty space in the middle of our guard, and we're going to solve it with the help of our Bridge Edge Loop tool. For step number 1, we're going to jump into local view by going up to the view menu and then down to local view, and then we're going to do toggle local view. And what this is going to do is allow us to isolate one object at a time, and that's basically just going to give us a little bit more space for us to work. And then we can always get out of local view by going back up to that same button. And then step number 2, we need to fill in the center of the guard, and we're going to do that with the help of the Bridge Edge Loops tool. I'll jump into edge selection mode by hitting 2, and then I'm going to shift select the bottom 2 edges. Then in that same order, I'll select the top 2 edges. Note that we need to select these in order. So whatever edges you selected first on the bottom, we also need to select that edge first at the top, giving us a total of 4 selected edges. Then I'll go up to the edge menu, and then I'll select Bridge Edge Loops. That's going to be the 3rd button from the top. And what this is going to do is connect the 2 rows, filling in the polygon faces needed for our holding edges, which is coming up in the next chapter. Great. And then step number 3, we simply just repeat this process for the other side. I'm going to orbit around and get into position. And then we'll deselect by clicking anywhere off of the object. I'll shift select the top 2 edges. Then in the same order, I'll shift select the bottom 2 edges. Then I'll go up to our edge menu again, then Bridge Edge Loops, and then that's going to be the 3rd button from the top. Great, and then once we have that, we're all ready to go. I'll do a quick orbit around to make sure that's all looking good, and we'll go ahead and finish the guard in the next chapter. The goal now is to take our base guard mesh and smooth it using our Subdivision Modifier, and we're going to do so with the help of our Edge Creases tool. And what Edge Creases do is allow us to control the smoothing operation that happens within our Subdivision Modifier. For step number 1, we'll add our Subdivision Modifier. I'll make sure that I'm in object mode by hitting tab. I'll make sure my guard is selected, and then in the modifiers panel, I'll add modifier. Then the second column, fifth one to the bottom, we'll select Subdivision Surface. And we'll set the similar default values that we've been working with. We're going to disable visibility in edit mode. Then we're going to set the levels of the viewport and the render to a value of 3. Usually I don't go much higher than 2 with our subdivisions, but since our mesh is very low res, we're going to start with the value of 3 here. Then we'll notice the guard looks rough, so we'll fix that with our shade smooth. While we're in object mode, right click shade smooth all the way at the top, and super special note, we need to be in object mode to be able to perform this action. It's happening on the object level. Then for step number 2, we need to make our edge selection for our edge creases. I'll hit tab to jump into edit mode. I hit 2 to jump into edge selection mode, and then I'm going to go to my select menu and then select the very first option at the top. And then after you hit that, we should then see everything is then highlighted. Now, before we apply our edge creases, we need to deselect 8 of the edges that are on the cylinder. Note that we want the edges, but we do not want the curved part. And what we do not want to do is, while we have everything selected, single click on this first edge to deselect it. This will make everything else become deactivated. We want to immediately shift click to deactivate the first edge and then continue on with the rest of the edges. And then shift select the second, and then I'm going to go all the way around, shift selecting 2 on each side until we have a total of 8 deselected. Again, we want the ones on the sides. Those are going to be creased, those are going to be hard, and the ones that we're deselecting are going to be smooth. Then once we have our selection, step number 3, we need to perform our edge crease. I'll go up to my edge menu. Down in the middle, I'll select edge crease. Now this is a 2-step operation, so as soon as you click on this, don't click on anything after you do this. After you click on edge crease, you'll notice that in the top left of your viewport, there's a crease value. You want to move your mouse up without clicking on anything until you see the value start to rise, and keep going up until you see a value of 1. Then once you see that reach a value of 1, click anywhere on your 3D view to confirm that action. Now if you've done that in the 3D view, our edges should now look bright pinkish purplish. That is how we know our edges are creased. And after we see that, if we tab out to object mode so we can see our subdivision modifier, we can now see that it's keeping its shape around those edges. And super special note here, our cylinder is still round. That's the key point here. The cylinder's round, but the edges are creased. But something's wrong here. Something feels a bit weird, and we notice that there are some dents in the mesh. Overall, it doesn't feel quite right. So step number 4, we're going to fix this by adding another subdivision modifier without the edge crease to be able to smooth this. Currently, our edges are too sharp. So I'm going to go up to my add modifier. Then second column, fifth one to the bottom, we'll select our subdivision surface modifier. Then after I add that, to be able to make a bit more space to work, I'm going to collapse my mirror, collapse the first subdivision modifier. Then our default values that we're going to set here are going to be disabled visibility in edit mode. Then we're going to set the value to 1 and 1. Now we're setting this lower because we already are doing 3 different subdivision values, which is fairly high. We don't want to go much more than this. If your computer's starting to slow down, you can always go lower on that. So instead of setting them to 3, you can set them to 2. Now we still don't see much changed here. So what's happening here? So we need to go into under the advanced menu in the second modifier, and we're going to disable edge creases. And all of a sudden it starts to feel a lot better. So what's happening here? Now the first subdivision modifier, this is adding resolution, and it's holding the edges and smoothing out the cylinder. Then the second subdivision modifier is ignoring those creases, allowing the mesh to then be smooth and have a rounded finish, which is what we want. Great. And now as we orbit around, we should start to see the mesh starts to feel very nice, starts to feel a lot more hard surface. We shouldn't see any dents or anything. It should look all very smooth, and we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal for these next few chapters is to model out the handle of our sword. First, we'll need to get out of local mode so that we can see all of our objects again. I'll go up to the view menu, and then about halfway down, go to the local view submenu, and then choose toggle local view, the top option. Then after you click that, you should see all of your meshes are back and we are ready to work. We're going to be in object mode now. So object mode, I'll select the handle, then we'll go up to the view menu and then go down to frame selected. This is where we're going to be working for the next few chapters. And then for step number 1, we need to make our oval shape on the handle. So while my handle is selected, I'll hit S on my keyboard, and then I'm going to scale down on my blue axis. Now, an oval shape is fine here. You don't have to have my exact values, but to give you my exact values, I'll go into my object properties, then under the scale, we're going to have 0.14, 0.07. Again, it doesn't have to be exact, but if you want to get the exact same result I have, go ahead and set those values. Then for step step number 2, we need to taper back on the handle. So the top edge is going to be wide and then it's going to taper down and get smaller towards the pommel. I'll hit tab to go into edit mode. Then I'll hit 2 to enter edge mode. Then I'm going to select one of those back edges, and then I'm going to go up to my select menu, then go down to select loops, and then select the top option, select edge loops. And that'll just guarantee and make sure that we have the entire back loop selected. And then once we have that selected, I'll go ahead and hit S to jump into my scale tool again. Then I'm going to scale it in on the red axis to match the width of the pommel. And then after we have that scaled in, we should start to now see that we have a taper effect happening. Larger on the guard, smaller towards the pommel. Then for step number 3, we need to add in our loop cuts and then scale them in to block in the shape of the handle. So while I'm still in edit mode, I'm going to hit Control R to enter loop cut mode. I'm going to hover my mouse over the center of the handle until I can find my preview edge. Then click to enter the loop cut mode, then hit escape to drop it on it. And that's going to perfectly drop it into the center of the handle. And now we're going to repeat this, but then this time in between the center loop cut and the guard. I'm going to hit Control R to enter loop cut mode, hover my mouse over to find the edge center, click on the edge to enter loop cut mode, hit escape to drop it. And then there we go. And then immediately we want to hit S on the keyboard to scale this in. This time we're going to use the white handle, our uniform scale. I'll scale that inwards to create that shape for the first grip. We're creating a two-handed grip here for this giant greatsword. Then we repeat that again, this time in between the center and the pommel. I hit Control R to enter loop cut mode, hover my mouse over the edge, find the preview edge, click to enter loop cut mode, hit escape to drop it in the center. Hit S to jump into my scale, then scale it down with the white uniform scale. And then that will be the second handle. And there we go. There we have our basic block in for our handle. And we'll continue with this in the next chapter. To finish off our handle, we need to add in our edge crease and our subdivision surface to smoothen it out. And while I'm still in edit mode, for step number 1, we'll make our selection, which is the center edge. I'm going to hit 2 on my keyboard to jump into edge selection mode. I'm going to select one of the edges in the very center of the blade. Then I'll go up to my select menu, select loops, and then select edge loops. That'll just make sure we have everything selected on that loop. Then after that, we should see that we have the edge going all the way around selected. Then step number 2, we need to add in our edge crease the same way we did it for the guard. So I'll go up to my edge menu, then I'll go about halfway down and then select edge crease. And then again, immediately after, don't click anything. We need to move our mouse upwards to increase the strength of the edge crease, and you'll see that in the top left of your viewport. Move your mouse until you see the top left value reach a value of 1, or your edges have turned completely purple. Then after that, we should then just click on our mouse to drop that in. Now we should see that our edges are now purple in the center. Then for step number 3, we need to add in our subdivision surface modifier. Go to the wrench icon, go to the modifiers panel. We'll select add modifiers, then second column, fifth one from the bottom, select subdivision surface. Same workflow that we've been doing. And then I'll disable in edit mode, and then I'm going to set both my viewport levels and my render levels to a value of 2. And that's that. And then I'll just jump, make sure I'm back in object mode to be able to see this. And we can see, of course, the surface still looks bumpy, so we need to shade smooth. So I'll right click, shade smooth all the way to the top. And again, to be able to shade smooth, we need to do this in object mode, not edit mode. Great. And that's a wrap for the block in of the handle, and we'll continue in the next chapter. The goal for this chapter is to add a torus shapes that will add the final details for our handle. And so step number 1, we'll add our torus primitive shapes. And whenever creating new objects, generally speaking, we want to start back in object mode. And then we'll go to our add menu, we'll go to the mesh submenu, and then we'll choose our torus shape. And there we go. At the center of the world will be our now giant torus. So before clicking anywhere, we now want to jump into our last action operator panel. And friendly reminder, if you don't see this, you might have clicked off it already if you might have performed another last action. So to get it back, just select your torus and then hit F9. Now I'm going to set my major segments to 20, minor segments to 10, minor radius to 0.15, and then I'm going to set my rotation value of X into 90 degrees. So what is all this stuff? Where did I get all those values from? The major segments are just a fancy word for how many polygons going around the torus. The minor segments are how many polygons going around the other way, the thickness of the torus. The minor radius is how round the torus is going to be, not how big it is, but how thick the overall shape is going to be. And again, the major segments and the minor segments, these are more just to start a bit more low polygon, and then we can always add more polygons in as we go. And then the rotation, of course, just to get it the initial direction that we want to go. And then our final step with this will just be our shade smooth. So I'll right click and then we'll go to our shade smooth at the top of the right click menu. And then that, of course, will again make it help it feel less polygonal and more smooth. All right. And then step number 2 is to set our location and scale settings. I'll hit G and then use my move and grab tool to move it down in a rough approximated area. Then I'm going to scale it down using S. I'm going to start with the uniform scale and just get the width looking good. And friendly reminder, this is a good time for us to do our frame selected so that we can work a bit easier. And then after I have my width set, I'm going to go ahead and then grab the blue Z-axis, and then I'll start making the overall oval shape so it starts to wrap around the handle a bit tighter. And super special note here, we want the torus embedded into the handle, not on top of the handle. So half of the inner part of the torus is not going to be visible at all. It's going to be inside the handle. All right, and then step number 3 is just to duplicate these and make out the other 2 torus shapes. So I'll right click, go to duplicate objects, I'll hit escape to drop it in place. And then again, I'll move it down in a rough approximated area where that thickness of the handle is most thick. I'll scale it in a little bit as needed, and then we'll duplicate one more time. So right click, duplicate objects, escape to drop it, and then I'll move it down to the base of the handle. Now for the final step, we have a minor shape to adjust at the bottom of our handle. You'll notice where the handle meets the pommel, there's a gap, and we want to scale up the handle so that it morphs from an oval shape into a circular shape. So I'll select my torus and then I'll scale it up with the blue axis until I reach that circular shape that we're looking for. Next, we'll need to scale up the handle. So I'll select the handle, jump back into edit mode. Now I'll need to select all the verts at the very base. So I'll go ahead and jump back into wireframe mode so that I can do this selection a little bit easier. Again, wireframe allows us to select through an object so we make sure we get everything. Then after I have my selection, I'll jump back into solid mode. I'll then scale it up with the blue Z axis until I meet that torus circular shape that we wanted. Great, and then that's going to end up being a wrap for the handle. So we'll go ahead and start working on the pommel in the next chapter. Our goal now is to model out the base of the pommel. I'll start back in object mode. I'll select my pommel base, and then we'll go up to the view menu. Select frame selected to be able to get into position and work a little bit easier. Then for step number 1, we're going to add the subdivision modifier to smoothen it out. I'll add the modifier, then I'll go all the way down to subdivision modifier. And then we'll use the same default values that we've been working with. We'll turn display and edit mode off, and then we'll set the levels within the viewport to a value of 2. And then we'll right click, shade smooth on the object. And again, that is all the same values that we've been working up to this point. And then for step number 2, we're going to insert a loop cut directly in the middle of the cylinder and adjust it. I'll jump back into edit mode. I'm going to hit Ctrl-R to enter loop cut mode, hover my mouse over to find the edge center, click on the edge to enter loop cut mode, hit escape to drop it, and then there we go. And then immediately we want to hit S on the keyboard to scale this in, and then I'll scale inwards using the white handle or uniform scale. And what we're after here is we're trying to get a little U shape going, adding a bit of a curve. Now for step number 3, we're going to add a star-shaped tip to this object. To do so, I'm going to jump in vert selection mode by hitting 1 on the keyboard, and then I'm going to shift select every other vertice on the very end of the cylinder. So I'll shift select, then I'll go around skipping every other vert, and then after I've completed the selection, I'll orbit around and confirm that I have all the right points selected. And then I'll scale inward with S using the white handle again, our uniform scale. Now a quick bonus tip, it's a bit hard to see at this point what we're doing. We can't really see the star-shaped ending. And we could go into wireframe mode, but even then sometimes wireframe mode can be difficult to see as well. To the left of wireframe, we have our X-ray view. We can toggle this on and off. I'm going to leave it on for now. And now if I orbit around in my perspective view, we can now see through objects and be able to make decisions a little bit easier. And there we go. Now I can clearly say this is a good star-shaped tip, and I'll just go back and turn off my X-ray view. And I'll check everything out, see how everything's going. Everything's looking good. I'll make my final tweaks from here. And then for step number 4, we'll duplicate the torus and then move it into place. Back into object mode, I'll select the torus shape. I'm going to right click, duplicate object, hit escape to drop it, and then immediately I'll hit my G to enter my move tool and then move it into place. Then after I have that in a rough position, I'll go ahead and start scaling in with the S. And I'm going to want this to be scaled down so it's covering the entire star-shaped tip. And then once we have that, that'll be a wrap for this chapter, and we'll continue with the pommel in the next chapter. Our goal now is to model at the very tip of the pommel, and we're going to start with blocking in the circular shape in the middle. And friendly reminder to frame selected one last time during this modeling section if you haven't done so already. We're going to need to have those precision controls here for the final steps. For step number 1, we need to scale the cylinder to match the very end of the base that we just modeled out. We want it to match the torus. So we're going to start in object mode. So I'll jump into my scale tool, I'll grab the blue Z axis, and then I'll scale inwards to match that height. Maybe leaving it just a little tiny bit bigger. And then for step number 2, we need to add in some loop cut. Then I'm going to jump back to edit mode. I'm going to hit Ctrl-R to enter loop cut mode. Then I'm going to insert one loop cut directly in the middle. So hover my mouse over to find the edge center. Click on the edge to enter loop cut mode, hit escape to drop it right there in the middle. And then we're going to add another one in between this new loop cut and the top. So I'll select right there to add my second loop cut. And then we do not want to do the bottom because we're going to delete those faces later to do the mirror modifier. And then for step number 3, we need to add in a mesh fill to fill in the top of the cylinder so that we can then start modeling it out. I'm going to hit W, and then I'm going to click and drag on the top edge of the cylinder, grabbing that top edge there. Now we need to actually insert the mesh fill, and we can do so by going up to the Vert menu, and then near the top, we're going to go to New Edge from Faces and Vertices, or you can just use the hotkey F to fill that in. Great, and now we should see that we now have that new face directly in the middle of our cylinder. And once we have that, for step number 4, we need to actually shape this out using an Inset and Extrusions. First, I'm going to just hit S for scale, and then I'm going to scale inwards just a little bit. Not too much, but just a little bit. Then from here, I'm going to grab my Inset tool. I'm going to create one inset on the top. So I'll click and drag on the handle to create that. And now you can see that we now have an edge loop going around the center there. Now we're going to extrude downward. So I'll grab my extrude tool, and immediately after selecting the extrusion tool, we want to change our handle from the yellow handle, which is our normal extrusion tool, to the XYZ handle, which will give us 3 different axes to work with that we'll be using in the coming chapters. I'll click and drag on the blue axis to create that base shape. And there we go. Now we have the shape blocked in, but we need to add a little bit more to finish this off. So we're going to go back to our Inset tool. I'm going to click on drag on that to create the interior. So now we have another loop going around the center there. And I'm going to do that the second time. So now we're going to have 2 insets on this bottom interior. And then while my second inset is still active, I want to merge those together. So we'll select the M hotkey to jump into our merge menu. And then I'm going to select merge at center. And there we go. Now what that's going to do is it's going to create us a triangle fan, which is just the terminology we use to describe that, where circular shape is connected by all triangles. All right, and now the bulk of the work is done, and we're going to continue shaping this out in the next chapter. Our goal now is to delete the bottom half. We're going to scale it into an oval shape, and then we're going to extrude out the very tip of the pommel. For step number 1, we're going to delete the bottom half. So I'm going to jump into face selection mode by hitting 3, and then I'll rotate under the cylinder to get into view, and then I'm going to box drag select the bottom half of the polygons. And then once I got my selection confirmed, I'm going to jump into X for delete, and then select delete faces. And then again, we're going to mirror that over in the next chapter. Great, now we're ready for step number 2, which is to shape out the tip into an oval shape. Now I want to jump back into object mode so I can scale the entire object together. So I'm going to hit tab to jump into object mode. I'm going to grab my scale tool by hitting S, and then I'm going to scale up using the Y green axis. And then I'm going to scale it up just to get a rough estimate of the oval shape matching the reference. And for step number 3, we're going to extrude out the tip. So I'm going to go back into edit mode. I'll make sure I have my face selection on by hitting 3 on the keyboard, and then I'm going to select the top 2 polygon faces. I'll grab my extrude tool. I'll use the green axis to extrude upwards. Then I'll jump into my scale tool by hitting S, and then I'm going to scale inwards with the red X axis. And then our final step for this chapter, step number 4, we're going to taper down the extrusion. I'm going to hit 2 on my keyboard to jump into edge selection mode, and then I'm going to shift select the 2 edges at the top of the extrusion. Hit G for our move tool, and then I'll go ahead and move the 2 edges down to create that taper effect. Great, and there we go. And then before we wrap this up, we'll just orbit around, make sure everything is looking good, and then we're going to finish off the pommel in the next chapter. The goal now is to mirror the bottom half, and then going to apply our subdivision and our holding edges to finish off the pommel. For step number 1, I'm going to add the mirror modifier. I'll select add modifier, and then in the second column towards the middle, we're going to select the mirror modifier. Now we can see that the default values this time are not exactly correct. We don't actually see the mirror happening. By default, the mirror axis is set to X, which is not what we want. So we're going to change this from a value of X, we're going to turn it off, and then we're going to turn on the Z axis. And there we go. Now we should see the bottom half of the pommel showing up. And then for step number 2, we're going to add in our subdivision modifier. I'll do add modifier, select subdivision surface all the way at the bottom, And then we're going to go ahead and set our default values here, disable display in edit mode, and then we're going to set the levels of viewport to 2. And then the last step here, we're going to just select the object, right click, and then shade smooth to smoothen out the normals. And don't forget, we need to be in object mode to be able to shade smooth. Now, if we take a look around, we're going to notice that we start to actually have a problem. The tip of the pommel is now having this very weird black edge to it. What is happening here? And so step number 3, we're going to fix this, and we're going to talk about a few troubleshooting techniques. And these things come up with your modeling, and oftentimes they are not so obvious. So a few tips to help troubleshoot these issues is that we want to try to remove all the variables as possible and reverse engineer what is happening. So I'm going to do this by toggling off visibility of our modifiers, because we weren't actually seeing this before we actually added the mirror in the subdivision. The monitor icon in the modifier display can help us do that. This is our viewport display. We have edit mode, which is what we've been using, and then the monitor icon to the right of that is going to disable the visibility in the entire viewport, so we can't see it in edit mode or object mode. I'll try toggling the monitor icon for visibility in the viewport on the subdivision surface first, and you can see it's still kind of sort of there. Then I'll try toggling off the monitor icon for the mirror modifier, and then if we rotate around, there we can now start to see we still have that issue on the bottom. We have some polygons on the back side of this from where we did our extrusion before. So these kind of things come up, and that's a good way to kind of reverse engineer it and figure out what's happening there. So I'll jump into edit mode. I'll jump into face selection by hitting 3. I'll select the 2 polygons. I'll hit X for delete, and then I'll delete faces. And there we go. Now the entire bottom half is deleted. Then I'll make sure my visibility for my mirror modifier is back on. I'll make sure the mirror modifier or the subdivision modifier, the monitor icon is on as well. And there we go. We'll continue in the next chapter. The goal now is to add in edge creases to turn our pommel into a hard surface mesh. In step number 1, we'll make our selection. So I'll go into edge mode by hitting 2 on my keyboard while I'm in edit mode. Then I'll start by selecting the 6 top edges that are around the extrusion of the pommel. I'll select one, and then I'll shift select around all of them on the top for a total of 6 edges. Then after that, we have 4 more edges to select, each corner edge going around. I'm going to shift select the 3 visible edges from the exterior, and then once I have those, I'll have 9 selected, and then don't forget that we have 1 in the middle or orbit around, and then select that 10th edge. Now we have 10 total edges selected. Now we need to select the loops, so I'll go up to my select menu, go down to select the loops, and then select edge loops. And there we should see we now have all the edges going around, and we're ready to do our edge crease. So step number 2, we need to do our edge crease. I'll go up to the edge menu, halfway down, and then I'll choose edge creases. And then once you click that, of course, don't click anywhere. Of course, after that, move your mouse while the tool is still active all the way up until you reach a value of 1, and you can see that at the top left of your viewport again. Once you have that, click to confirm. Now we should see all of our edges have turned purple. Now we can go ahead and hit tab to jump back in object mode, and now we should see that the mesh is now looking very hard surface and everything's looking great. I'll rotate around, see how that's looking, and we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal now is to take our model from this grayscale look and create our materials, and we're going to do so with the help of the shading tab. Now, if you have struggled in the past with the shading tab, no worries. I remember what it felt like building my first shader network, so we're going to really break things down moving forward. For step number 1, we're going to go from the layout tab and we're going to open up the shading tab. Now for this next step, you don't have to do this, but for me, to help with the recording, I'm going to go ahead and expand the 2 sides so that we can focus on the 3D view and the shader editor. This is all we're going to be using for these next few chapters. Now this next step you will want to do, and this will help us moving forward, I'm going to frame select it on my guard. I'll make sure that I'm in object mode. I'm going to select the guard, and then I'm going to go up to my view menu and then frame selected. And then that's of course going to snap us to our guard, and now we can go ahead and orbit around. And now we're going to be able to select any of our objects very easily to be able to test things out. And now for step number 3, we're going to set up the blade material. I'm going to select the blade object in my 3D view. Now, after you select your blade object, you should see the shader network pop up. And if you do not see this, you may need to click the new button at the top of the shader editor. Click that and you should be good to go. If you already see these 2 nodes in our shader editor, you're good to go. And now for step number 4, we're going to get to know the 4 material properties that we're going to be working with primarily throughout the rest of the course. Now we know about base color from our Minecraft project, right? This is where we change the color of the material. The next one we're going to get to know is the metallic property, and we can adjust this by clicking and dragging on the parameter left and right. The higher the value is, the more metallic it's going to be, and then the lower the value that is, the less metallic it's going to be. And then I'm going to leave this to a value of 1 for my metallic properties. Now we may not see much yet And this is because the metallic parameter works alongside the roughness parameter, which is the third parameter we're going to be using. And if I click on drag on my roughness, we can now see it start to move. And you can start to see, we can think of the roughness parameter as how blurry the reflections are going to be. So as I go higher, the reflections get more blurry. Then as I go lower, the reflections are going to be a lot more clear. And then I'm going to leave this on a value of somewhere around 0.1, so very low. Again, that's 0.1. Great, and now we can orbit around and we can see that our blade is now feeling much, much more believable. It's feeling much, much more metallic. And then the last parameter we're going to get to know is the emission, and we're going to get to know the emission a bit later when we start working on our runes. And that's the initial setup, and we're going to continue to build out our network in the next chapter. So the question now becomes, how do we go from a basic metallic shader to our complex shader network with all the scratches, the glowing runes, and all the fancy stuff happening? Our shader network right now looks something like this, just 2 nodes, very simple. And by the time we're done, we're going to end up with a much larger shader network, which can be a bit intimidating at first. So what is all this stuff and how do we get there? And that brings us to our goal for this chapter, which is demystifying shader networks. This chapter will be an explanation, so sit back and relax and we'll get hands-on again in the next chapter. We can break down a shader network into 3 parts: nodes, properties, and connections. Our nodes are similar to objects when we model. They're just starting points for what we're creating. Our properties are how we modify those nodes, so instead of edit mode for our objects while we're modeling, we have parameters to adjust within our nodes. Then we have connections to be able to connect all of them together to do a lot of really creative stuff. But the question then becomes, what do we connect to what? What works with what? Generally speaking, we have 3 different categories when we're talking about different shader nodes. The first one is our output, and that's going to be our easiest one. All we need to know about the output nodes is that this is how we tell Blender what node is going to be the last node within our shader network. This is the node that connects to the actual object in our 3D view. Next, we have our shader nodes. These are the nodes that have parameters for controlling things like color, reflectivity, whether or not it looks like metal, whether or not it looks like glass. These are our shader properties. The last category, we have our shader input nodes. Now, what all can we do with our shader input nodes? The most important one is, generally speaking, is going to be the image texture node, which is an image that we bring from outside of Blender. Usually we get these from an online resource such as textures.com, 3dtextures.me, polyhaven.com. All of these are great resources to find image textures. These are the 2 textures that we're going to be working with to build this shader network. We have one for our scratches and then the other one to create the runes. Then we have our mapping nodes. Mapping nodes are how we control properties such as location and scale of that image texture that we bring in onto the object. We can think of this as very similar to our move, rotate, and scale tool that we used in our 3D view. But the mapping nodes are for image textures within our shader nodes. Then we have things like color ramps. Color ramps are really good for taking image textures and then controlling the controller whether how bright it is, how dark it is, and overall crunching the values. Then we have our mix RGB node, which is very similar to our color ramp, but this is good for combining textures and overall colorizing different textures. Then we have our texture coordinate nodes, which I'll explain more in a bit in the next chapter. All this is going to seem intimidating at first, but just like modeling, as we use these nodes over and over and over, they'll slowly start to click and they're going to make a lot more sense. And we'll start building this in the next chapter. Our goal now is to apply our scratches texture onto our blade, and we're going to do so with the help of using image projections. For step number 1, we're going to import our scratches texture. And again, downloads are below the video. We'll jump into our textures folder and then we're going to locate our scratches image texture. Then while my blade is still selected, I'll drag and drop the scratches image texture into my shader editor. And once I have that into my shader editor, I'm going to bypass the principled BSDF and I'll click and drag on my color parameter and I'll drop that into my surface parameter of my material output so I can see it in my 3D viewport on top of the object. Now we'll notice that the scratches on the blade look very stretched and sort of distorted. So why is this happening and how do we fix it? By default, Blender uses UVs to apply the image texture to the object. UVs are usually done in the UV editing tab and ours is currently broken. So what are UVs? Similar to this chocolate wrapper, UVs are a flat 2-dimensional version of the object that we usually create in the UV editing tab. Now UVs are usually where a lot of beginners tend to hit a wall and UV editing is a very important process to get to know, but there's another way that's a little bit easier for us to get started, and that's going to be using image projections. Image projections are a way inside of our shader editor without using the UV editing tab to be able to apply image textures to our objects using simple XYZ coordinates. They won't work for every case, but they are a good way for us to apply basic images to our 3D model. And then we'll learn more about UV editing in a later course. And for step number 2, we're going to create our nodes. Inside of our shader editor, I'm going to select the add menu. And at the very top, we're going to see our search option, and we can search for all of the new nodes that we're going to create using this toolbar. I'll select search, then I'm going to type in mapping to be able to find our mapping node. Once we see mapping show up, I'll hit enter to confirm. And then there we see we get the new node attached to our cursor. And then I'm going to click next to the scratches images to the left to drop it into our shader editor. Then we're going to repeat this process to create our texture coordinate node. I'll go to my add menu, I'll select search, and then I'm going to type in texture coordinate. And then once we see that show up, I'll click enter to confirm, and then I'll click just to the left of our mapping node to drop it in. Then for step number 3, we're going to make our connections. We'll start with our texture coordinate node, and we'll find our object parameter directly in the middle. We'll click and drag this object parameter into our vector input of our mapping node. Then I'm going to find my vector output of the mapping node, and then click and drag that into the vector input of our scratches image texture. And if we look back at our object, we'll notice that our stretching is now mostly gone. Great. Okay, so what is all this stuff? Our texture coordinate node is how we tell Blender what source we're going to apply the image texture to the object. If you're using UV editing, you simply use the UV output. If you're using an image projection like we are now, we're going to use the object output. The other options are a bit more complicated that I generally never use, so we'll skip over those. And then step number 4, we need to set up our mapping node. Top of our mapping node, we have our type. We want to change this to a texture, the second option to the top. This just tells Blender that all of the parameters that below that we'll be working with an image texture. Then we're going to set our scale value to a value of 3 in X, Y, and Z. Great, and there we go. Now we see that our scratches are much more visible. Now, the scratches still aren't quite right. They're still stretched a little bit. And for step number 5, we need to apply scale on our blade object. If our scale value is not uniform, our object parameter on our texture coordinate node is also not going to be uniform. It's going to be slightly stretched. This is of course from when we scaled earlier during the modeling process. So to fix this, I'll select my blade, I'll go up to the object menu, go down to apply, and then I'm going to select apply scale. And then after that, we'll see that the scale values are all reset. They're now going to all be a value of 1. And now we'll see our texture is perfectly square and everything is good to go. Okay, so all of that is going to feel like it's a bit hard to digest the first time you do that. This is a lot of new information, but generally speaking, we only need to build this once. And then for the next few chapters, we're just going to duplicate and tweak these as we go. It's the same setup for all of our shaders, and we'll continue that in the next chapter. Our goal now is to take the scratches texture inside of our roughness and create some believability within our metallic blade shader. And we're going to do this with the help of the color ramp node. And the color ramp node is going to give us a bit more control between our scratches and our roughness shader to be able to control the blurriness of the reflections. For step number 1, I'll create the color ramp node. I'll go up to the add menu, select search, and then type in color ramp. And note that this is all one word, color ramp, one word. Once I see that, I'll hit enter to confirm. And then the color ramp node is attached to my cursor. I'll hover over in between my scratches image texture and my connection of my material output, and you'll notice that connection then becomes highlight, and then I can just click on that to automatically insert that color ramp node. And now we should see that we have our scratches color output connected to the factor of our ramp, and then the color ramp out color is then connected to the surface parameter node in our material output. For step number 2, I'll adjust my color ramp settings. I'll click and drag on the white values, and then you'll notice that we can now start to adjust how much white values of this image that we're seeing. This is sort of like a levels tool if you're coming from a Photoshop background. Now this is very important because this is how you control how much blurriness that we're going to see within our reflection. Now step number 3 is to apply our color ramp into our shader input. Out color of our ramp into the roughness parameter. Then I'll drag the BSDF parameter from our principled shader into the surface input of our material output. Now if I open it on the 3D view, we can start to see that we start to have some kind of scratches happening within the reflections, but it's not enough. And then step number 4, final tweaks, move the white handle down. Then I'll drag the white value to the left a little bit, and I'll do that until I start to notice that we get some roughness happening within our reflection. This is very similar to when we adjusted the roughness parameter earlier in the shader itself to make it more blurry, but now we have the ability to do this with our scratches texture. Adding more white simply means we're pushing it more towards a value of 1, and a value of 1 means more roughness. Great, and so this is where I'm going to leave off, and you'll notice a little bit of tweaking goes a very long way. It's a very common technique that I find myself doing to nearly all of my metallic shaders. And we're going to continue building our shaders out in the next chapter. The goal now is to duplicate our blade shader down to the guard, and we're going to implement a new image projection type called box projections. For step number 1, I'm going to rename our material. I'll make sure I have my blade selected. I'll click where it says material. Material is our default name that Blender gives us for our material. I'll highlight that and then change that to blade. Great, and now we're going to be ready to start duplicating this onto the guard. I'll select my guard, and then we should see the shader editor goes blank. I'll select my material browser, and then I'm going to choose a blade material. So we're assigning the same material. We're going to use it as a preset for this material. Great, and now we're going to see in our viewport that the material is now assigned. Then I'll click the duplicate material button to the right of our material name, 3 buttons over. It's going to be the double stacked paper icon. Once we click that, we can now see that our material name was automatically renamed to blade.001. That's how we know the material has been duplicated. And now all these edits that we're going to apply inside of this material is not going to be affected on the original blade material. Then I'll just rename this to guard, and then we're ready to start modifying our material. Now we notice that we have a problem. The shader doesn't appear to be working on the guard, right? The scratches are now broken. They look stretched on the sides. They look okay on the top and the bottom of the guard, but not on the side. What is going on here? Well, as we learned earlier, our image projection setup works by projecting an image onto an object within our material. As we can see in this demonstration that the sides of the checkerboard are stretched. This is because it's a 2D image projection. So what is going on here? The default projection type within Blender is flat projection type, meaning it only attempts to project from one angle. This is a parameter on our image texture that we imported in Blender. And this works okay for our sword because our sword is a very two-dimensional object. There isn't much depth happening here. And we see the stretching happening on the sphere object, but we cannot see the stretching happening on the blade because again, the blade is very flat. And for the guard, we're going to need a different projection type. If we change our image projection type to box, we can now project not from one angle, but from 3 different angles, which gives us a great solution for objects that have a lot more depth to them. As we can see here, flat breaks down on a 3-dimensional sphere, and the box projection type is holding up just fine, which is what we're going to be working with on our guard. Now, as a quick bonus tip here, the image texture node is a bit confusing because it has a bunch of different parameters, but we only see the values and not the parameter name of which those values belong to, which is terribly confusing. If we hover over our mouse on any parameter or any tool within Blender, we will get the documentation for this. So both the parameter name and the definition for that parameter, which is incredibly useful, and I use this a lot. Now I'm going to select where it says flat, and then I'm going to change this parameter to box, which is our box image projection type that will change the direction from 1 directional to 3 directional. Great, and as soon as we apply that, we should now see that there's no more stretching on the side of the guard. Now, it's still not quite right, so step number 4, we need to apply our scale. I'll go to my object properties, and we can see that again we have a non-uniform scale, which means our object parameter and our texture coordinate node is also going to be non-uniform, meaning it's going to be stretched. So I'll just repeat the process we did in the last chapter. I'll go up to the object menu, down to apply, and then I'm going to apply scale while I have my guard selected. Once we do that, we can then go back to our object properties, and now we should see that we have a scale value of 111, making our scale value now a uniform scale, a scale that is consistent in X, Y, and Z. And for step number 5, we'll adjust the base color parameter. I'll go inside my principled BSDF, I'll click on my base color parameter, and then I should get my color wheel pop up. The value I'm going to use is a value of 0.08 in the hue, 0.6 in the saturation, and then 0.3 in the value. Again, all these values came from when I prepped the lecture. If you'd like to set these manually using the color wheel, feel free, but the end result is just a brownish goldish shade. And then for our final step number 6, we'll adjust the scale of our mapping node. As we can see that the size of the scratches on the guard make it feel a bit low res. So we can change the scale values to a value of 2 on our mapping node in X, Y, and Z coordinates. And there we go. We should now see that the scratch texture looks a lot more high resolution. And then we'll continue working on our shaders in the next chapter. Our goal now is to build out the handle material and finish off the base materials for the sword. For step number 1, we'll assign and duplicate our blade material onto the handle. I'll start by selecting the handle. I'll go to my material browser. Then I'll select the blade material. Then we should see our blade materials now assigned on our handle in the 3D view. Then after that, we need to duplicate and rename this material. So I'll click the double stacked paper icon, 3rd button to the right of the name, click that, and once we see the new material name is blade.001, I'll then rename this to handle. Now we are free to customize this material without interfering with the original blade material. Then step number 2, we need to reset a few of the parameters that we are no longer going to use within the shader. I'm going to delete the image texture and the color ramp node first. I'll select both of those. those. Then I'll hit X for delete. Then on our principled BSDF, we're now going to set the metallic value back to a value of 0 to make it non-metallic. Then I'm going to bring the specular value down to a value of 0. This will completely turn off the reflections from our shader. Great, and once we have that, we're ready for step number 3, and that's going to be to bring in our leather cord image texture and assign that. I'll go back to the downloads, the same downloads we've been working with, and then I'll go into my textures directory and then locate the leather cord image texture. I'll drag and drop that into my shader and place it in between our mapping node and our principled BSDF. I'll then connect the out vector of our mapping node into the vector of our image texture, then the out color of our image texture into the base color of our parameter of our principled BSDF. And there we go. Now we should start to see that we're starting to get something happen on our material. Now for step number 4, we need to set up the rotation settings of our mapping node to orient the texture in the right direction. But at this point, when we look at these values, which XYZ value on the rotation are we supposed to actually use? And if you're looking at this and you think you have no idea, that is perfectly normal. Before we do anything, we just want to apply the scale and the rotation values. In our object properties, you'll see that the rotation value is currently set to 90 degrees. And this is not inherently bad, but it does make the rotation within our mapping node much more confusing, since we're now going to be trying to rotate on top of an already existing rotate value, which is just terribly confusing. So I'll select my handle, I'll go back up to my object menu, I'll go down to apply, and then I'm going to apply rotation. And just a general note here, in this specific example, we're going to apply rotation, not apply scale like we've been using. And there we go. Now our rotation values should be set all to a value of 0 in X, Y, and Z. Now we're going to do the same for this scale as well. So we'll go up to our object menu, go back to apply, and then apply scale. And then once you do that, we should now see that our scale value is now again a uniform scale 1, 1, 1. So we're not going to have any unwanted stretching happening. Now, which rotation value do we want to adjust? A good tip that I like to do in these cases is jump into my rotation tool inside of my 3D viewport. Here I can test out the rotation and figure out which direction I want to go. In this case, you'll notice if I rotate using the blue handle, I am now mimicking the direction I want my texture to rotate. I'm going to undo out of that, and then if we look up into our XYZ axis at the top right of our viewport, we'll see that the blue axis is the Z axis. So blue handle, blue axis, and there we go. We have our axis that we want to rotate, which is the Z axis. Now if I click and drag on the Z axis of the mapping node, we now start to rotate it around in that same direction we were in our viewport with our object. So it's a much more intuitive way of figuring out which direction we want to go with this. Then I'm going to set the Z axis to a value of 90 degrees exactly. And there we go. Now we can see it's rotated in the right way. And now we can set our scale values. I'm going to move these back to a value of 1 in X, Y, and Z. And that's it. That's a wrap for our handle material. And as a bonus tip, we will be using the flat image projection again. So in the guard, we changed this to box. In this specific case, we're going to leave it flat. And the reason for this is, although you'll notice on the sphere, it looks stretched because the sphere has enough depth for us to see this, but the handle is a much more oval shape. So it's much flatter. Combine that along with the fact that the texture has a horizontal pattern. This makes the perfect solution for creating a seamless pattern that's going to go all the way around the handle. And then our final step number 5, we're just going to finish the base materials off by assigning the guard material to the remaining objects of the handle. I'll start by selecting our torus object, go to the material browser, and then select guard material. And we don't need to rename, we do not need to duplicate, we can just simply assign this, and then we're done with these. I'll repeat this for the remaining objects. We have a total of 6 assignments that we have to do. So I'll select another torus, material browser, select guard, and then I'm just going to repeat this process for the remaining objects. And then that's it. That's going to be a wrap for our base materials. And next up, we're going to get into the runes, and we're going to continue that in the next chapter. The goal now is to apply the runes to the blade, and we're going to do so with the help of our emission parameter. Step number 1, we need to duplicate our texture coordinate in our mapping node. First, I need to select my blade and jump into the shader editor. I'll select both of them, our texture coordinate and our mapping node, and then I'm going to go up to my node menu, and then I'm going to select duplicate. And once we hit duplicate, then we'll see that we have 2 nodes attached to my cursor. I'm going to move these down below and then click to drop them back into my shader editor. Now, step number 2 is to import the runes texture. I'll go back to my downloads, go into the textures directory, and then we're going to locate the runes.jpg. And then I'm just going to click and drag them into my shader editor. Now, for step number 3, we need to make our connection. So I'm going to plug the mapping node's out vector into the in vector of the image texture node. And then I'm going to take my runes out color, and then I'm going to plug them into the emission slot of the principled BSDF shader. Now, by default, we may or may not be seeing anything, and that's because we need to set the emission value to a value of 1. If it's set to a value value of 0, that means it's turned off. So be sure to turn that on to value 1. Now for step number 4, we still do not quite see what we're expecting to see. So I'm going to go through some steps on how I figure out on how to set my mapping values. So keep your eyes on the video for a bit, and then after I'll give you my values to make it a little bit easier on you. First, the object parameter in our texture coordinate node, the 0 location, the 0 rotation, and the scale values start at the origin of the object. So what is the origin of the object? In the layout tab, we'll see that we have a little orange dot on the object. This is the origin, is what Blender thinks is the center of the object. This is what the texture coordinate node's object parameter starts at. So this is a value of 0, 0, 0 on the texture coordinate location node. First, I'm going to set the scale value. So if I shift click and drag on the scale and move this in X and Y until I get something in the ballpark. Shift click and drag is how we move a parameter with precision control. Next, I'll need to disable the repeating texture. I'm going to set this to clip so that we're only going to see one of them. Next, I'll need to find the center. I could easily move these values manually to figure out where it is. But since this texture starts at the center where the origin is, I want my runes to be in the center. So I can just offset this half of whatever my scale value is. So these are all the values I ended up with. My scale value is going to be a 0.1 in scale X, a value of 7 in scale Y, and then Z doesn't technically do anything here, so I'll just leave it at a value of 1. And then I'll do the location of being of negative 0.05, which is half of my scale X. And there we go. Now it's all going to be centered. And working with the mapping node can take some time to get used to. It can be a bit confusing at first, but after you get some practice, you'll notice that eventually you'll start to feel like you have some control with this. And that is our runes, and we'll continue in the next chapter. The goal now is to add the color and the bloom effect to our runes. For step number 1, I'm going to boost the emission strength. I'm going to set the value to a value of 100, which will make it very bright and easy to see. But this doesn't quite feel right. Something's missing, right? And that leads us to step number 2, which is to set up our render properties. I'll go up to my render properties panel and we're going to turn on ambient inclusion and bloom. I'll start with the ambient inclusion settings. I'll set the distance as 2 and then the factor of 2 as well. This is going to help exaggerate the contact shadows, and that's going to be most visible where our blade connects with the guard, just giving us a much more believable shadow area. Then I'm going to turn on bloom. I'm going to turn my threshold to 5, and that's basically going to tell Blender to only do the really hot areas, which is just isolating our runes to be the only thing that's going to glow. Then I'm going to change the radius to 5 as well. It's going to lower it so we don't get such a widespread glow. And then I'm going to change the intensity value to a value of 0.2. And that's just going to overall make the bloom a lot brighter. And then for step number 3, we're going to set up the color using the Mix RGB node. Back in our shader editor, I'll go up to the add menu and I'm going to use the search once again. And then I'm going to search for Mix RGB. And for a general note here, Mix RGB is one word, not two. Once I find that, I'll hit enter to confirm. Then that's going to create the node. It's going to attach it to my cursor. And then I'm going to hover over the connection between our image texture and our emission parameter until I see that highlight. And then once I do, I'm going to click to drop it to automatically connect those up. And now we should see our out color of our runes going into the color 1 of our Mix RGB node, and then the out color of our Mix RGB going into our emission parameter of our principled BSDF shader. Okay, so what's happening here? We lost our runes, things are getting really bright. How do we control this a bit better? What the Mix RGB node is currently doing is it's mixing between color 1 and color 2. If I click and drag on the factor parameter, you'll see that we get more or less of the color 2 parameter being mixed in overall. The color 1 is the main parameter, and then color 2 is what gets put on top of color 1. And we control how much of that with our factor value. The first value we're going to set is set the factor to 1. So we're going to colorize the color 2 parameter. I'm going to click on that, and then we'll see a color wheel pop up. And then if I just click and drag around on this, you'll see that we start to colorize our glow that we're getting. Very simple. I'm going to set my values manually, and I'm going to use 0.03 in the hue, 1 in the saturation, and then 1 in the value. That's just going to make it a very vibrant orange color. And now we want to bring the runes texture back into this. Currently, we're overriding all of that. So I'll go up to my mix parameter, and then we'll see we get a big list of stuff. These are our blending modes. And if you're coming from a Photoshop background or another image editor, these might be very familiar for you. If not, that's okay. The only 2 parameters that I really find myself using a lot is multiply and add. And in this case, I'm going to use the multiply parameter. So I'll change that to multiply. Now it's working. We're getting our runes. But what exactly is happening here? And basically, what multiply is doing for us is it's taking the black values from our rune image and using that to remove the orange values going into the emission. And we'll get more into the Mix RGB node a lot in the later courses. I use this node a lot. And that's going to be a wrap for our blade, and we'll do the final shader in the next chapter. The goal now for the final chapter of our shaders is to set up the Pommel shader. For step number 1, we're just going to duplicate the Pommel shader. I'll select my Pommel, I'll immediately duplicate it with the double stack paper icon, and then I'm going to rename it to Pommel. So the base shader is all set up for us. And then for step number 2, we just need to copy the rune nodes over. I'm going to select my blade again, and then I'm going to select the texture coordinate node, and then shift select the mapping node and the multiply mix RGB node. And then once we have those 3 nodes selected, I'll go up to my node menu and then select copy, and this will allow us to paste it over into the Pommel shader. I'll select my Pommel, go to node menu, then click paste. Then after that, we should see that we have our 3 nodes set up. Then step number 3, we need to import the Rune Solo image texture. Located in the downloads, inside the textures directory, I'll grab my Rune Solo. I'm going to drag and drop it into my shader network. Next, I'm going to make those connections, mapping node into the vector of the image texture, and then image texture color into the color 1 slot of our mix RGB multiply. And I'll plug that mix RGB multiply into the emission. Now, we don't see anything just yet. So what's going on here? Well, step number 4, we need to set up our parameters, and I'm going to put my emission strength all the way up to a value of 100, the same value that we used with our blade material. And then we should start to see something, but our mapping and our tiling and our repeats are not set up correctly. So first I'll show you how I get these values, and then after I'm done, I'll share with you the exact values again. First, I'm going to reset all my parameters to the default values on the mapping node, 0 for location and rotation, and then 1 for scale. I'm going to disable the repeating texture, set it by setting it to clip, so we only see 1. And so now I'm going to adjust my location X and Y until I can get those lined up, and I'm using shift, click, and drag to be able to precision control this. And note here that I'm not trying to do the Z because this is a flat image projection, not a box. It's going to go right through the pommel. And we're going to set this to -0.5 in location X and Y. Then scale for 1 in all directions. Now, your values may end up being slightly different. This is a very organic process. Small discrepancies should be expected. And now that's going to be a wrap for the Pommel shader and the rest of our shaders for our sword. And now it's time to check out what we're going to do in part 3 of this series. But before that, I encourage you to click the link in the description to learn more about our premium membership. This is where you will unlock the Blender track, which is the ultimate beginner to advanced transformation. This is where you'll find the rest of the fast track army leveling up and climbing the mountain of mastering Blender. Seeing everyone's progress every day is a huge motivator, and I hope to see your progress in the Discord. Then in part 3, we'll learn about geometry nodes and build the fire effects on the blade and build out the environment. And we'll end with a bonus character integration. And so stick it out with me and jump to part 3 right here on YouTube.